I expected a business trip to London, but I ended up trapped on a plane by a hidden network that had already declared me dead. By the time I realized I was a target in a massive, organized scheme, I had to choose between my life and the empire I spent a decade building. The suit I was wearing cost more than the average annual salary of the flight attendants, currently whispering behind their hands in the galley. But that wasn't why they were staring. They were staring because I was a black man sitting in 1A, a seat reserved for the elite, and in their narrow worldview, someone who looked like me belonged in the back of the plane, preferably tucked away where I wouldn't disturb their fragile ecosystem of privilege. My name is Marcus Thorne. People usually recognize the name from the headlines. Thorne Aviation. I'm the CEO of one of the fastest-growing logistics and private charter empires in the world. I'm the man who built the infrastructure that keeps global supply chains moving, and today, I was flying commercial, only because my private jet was undergoing a mandatory engine overhaul. The flight was a red-eye from New York to London. I'd spent the last 48 hours closing a merger that would redefine regional air travel, and all I wanted was to close my eyes, lean back in the lie-flat seat, and drift into a deep sleep. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. "Excuse me, sir," a voice cut through the muffled drone of the cabin. It was the lead flight attendant, a woman named Sharon. Her badge hung slightly crooked and her eyes held a brittle, practiced coldness. "We've had a scheduling discrepancy. This seat was designated for a high-priority passenger. We're going to need you to move to row 24. I looked up from my tablet, my brow furrowed. "Row 24? That's an economy seat, Sharon. I paid for first class. I checked in 3 hours early. My seat is confirmed." "I understand," she said, her voice dripping with a false, saccharine sympathy. "But company policy allows for seat reallocation in the event of unforeseen priority requirements. We have a gentleman in row 4 who, well, he simply prefers the front. And we'd rather keep him comfortable. Please, cooperate. I don't want to make a scene." She glanced behind her. 2 seats back, a man in a rumpled linen suit was watching the interaction with a smug, satisfied grin. He wasn't a celebrity, not a diplomat, not anyone of note. He was just a guy who had clearly decided that he was entitled to my space because he was white, and I was Marcus Thorne, but to them, I was just a target. "I'm not moving," I said, my voice steady but sharp. "I'm not moving for a gentleman who thinks he can purchase my seat after the fact. If he wants 1A, he can take it up with the airline's booking desk. But I'm staying put." Sharon's face flushed a deep, indignant red. She leaned in, lowering her voice to a hiss. "Sir, you need to understand that the atmosphere on this flight is delicate. We have protocols for passengers who refuse to follow crew instructions. If you persist in this aggression, I will have no choice but to involve security. Do you really want to be escorted off this plane in handcuffs, Mr. Thorne?" She didn't know my name, obviously. If she had known I was the person currently in negotiations to buy out the parent company of this very airline, she wouldn't have been breathing in my direction. "Is that a threat, Sharon?" I asked, setting my tablet aside. "It's a reality check," she retorted. The cabin had gone silent. The woman next to me pulled her legs in, looking terrified. The man in row 4 was now laughing softly to himself, tapping his fingers on the armrest. I felt a surge of cold, calculated fury. I'd spent my life fighting for every inch of ground I stood on. I'd been followed by security in department stores, pulled over for driving a luxury vehicle while suspicious, and passed over for promotions by men with half my intellect. I was tired. I was so incredibly tired. "Fine," I said, standing up. I stood at 6'3", towering over her. She took an involuntary step back. "You want me to move? I'll move." I walked toward the front of the plane, but not toward the back. I walked to the cockpit door and knocked firmly. "Sir, you cannot do that," Sharon shrieked, hurrying after me. "Security! I need security immediately. We have an unruly passenger making a move on the flight deck." The pilot opened the door, his face masked in confusion. He looked at the frantic flight attendant, then at me. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my mobile phone, already logged into the secure portal of the airline's internal management software, the one I'd been beta testing for the merger. "Captain," I said, my voice echoing through the silent cabin. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I am the lead investor of the parent group that owns this carrier. I have the override codes, and I have the authority to ground this flight effective immediately for a gross violation of service standards and discriminatory behavior." The pilot's eyes widened as he glanced at his tablet. The screen was flashing red. "I'm firing this entire crew," I continued, pointing a steady finger at the trembling Sharon. And you, Captain? You're next if you don't step out of that cockpit and help me identify exactly who approved this move. Just as the captain began to stammer an apology, the intercom crackled. A voice, cold and detached, came over the speaker. We have an unauthorized access alert, locking down the aircraft. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died, and the heavy thud of the cabin door locking from the outside echoed through the plane. We weren't just delayed, we were trapped. The cabin plunged into an eerie, suffocating silence, broken only by the hum of the auxiliary power unit struggling to keep the air circulation going. The emergency lighting cast long, jagged shadows against the cream-colored walls, making the plane look less like a vessel of luxury and more like a tomb. Sharon, who had been seconds away from a smug victory, now stood frozen, her mouth agape as the cockpit door slammed shut and the electronic locks engaged with a heavy, final-sounding clunk. The pilot, a man whose face had drained of all color, was frantically tapping at his console. "The system is locked out, sir," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I can't override the ground command. This isn't standard." Ground command? I walked back into the center of the first-class aisle, my presence commanding the space. I looked at the man in row 4, who was now clutching his armrests, his smug expression replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. Who authorized a ground lockout on a commercial flight over a seat dispute? This isn't just bad service, Sharon. This is an intentional obstruction of operations. I don't know, she stammered, her hands shaking so violently she dropped her service tray. The sound of plastic shattering against the carpeted floor echoed like a gunshot. The station manager said there was a priority order. They said you were flagged. Flagged for what? I demanded, stepping into her space. Flagged for being a black man who knows his worth? Flagged for refusing to be pushed to the back of the bus? Suddenly the intercom crackled again, but it wasn't the captain. It was a distorted, digitized voice, the kind that sounds like it's been scrubbed through a dozen filters to hide the speaker's true identity. Mr. Thorne, the voice grated through the speakers, making everyone jump. Your presence on this flight is, as you suspect, not a matter of a seat reallocation. We have been waiting for you to board. You've been far too busy with your mergers and your acquisitions. It was time for a more direct conversation. The passengers were now whispering, the panic rising in the cabin like a tide. A few people had stood up, trying to peer toward the front, but the crew members were barricaded behind the locked doors. "Who is this?" I called out, my voice booming through the cabin. "Is this some kind of sick joke? You think you can intimidate me with a software lockout?" "Intimidate?" The voice chuckled, a cold, dry sound. "No, Marcus. We don't want to intimidate you. We want to clean up. We've been tracking your movements for months. We know about the files you moved to your cloud server last night. We know about the evidence of the organized scheme you've been unraveling in the shipping docks. You thought you were just a businessman, but you've been playing detective in a world where secrets are protected by blood." My heart skipped a beat. I had been investigating a string of inconsistencies in our cargo manifests, missing containers, altered bills of lading, and ghost shipments coming through the very ports I managed. I hadn't told anyone, not even my personal security detail. How did they know? "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, though my mind was racing, cataloging every person I'd spoken to in the last week. "Denial is a survival mechanism," the voice continued, "but it won't save you. You've brought the right people together in this cabin. The crew, the passengers, everyone here is a cog in a much larger machine. We have successfully initiated a Protocol Red. You are currently on an aircraft that is no longer officially in the air. As far as the air traffic controllers are concerned, this flight has been diverted to an auxiliary strip for technical inspection. In reality, you are being held in a private facility." I walked toward the window, pulling the shade up. Outside, the tarmac wasn't the bustling neon blur of an international airport. It was dark, desolate, and surrounded by high fences topped with razor wire. There were no airport vehicles, no baggage carts, only 3 black SUVs parked in a perfect, aggressive formation under the flicker of a single dying spotlight. "You're not airline management," I said, realizing the gravity of the situation. "You're the people I've been looking for." "We prefer the term interested parties," the voice replied. "And you have made a very grave mistake, Mr. Thorne. You didn't just fire the crew today. You forced us to reveal our hand before we were ready. Now, we have a choice. We can let you go and watch you destroy everything we've built, or we can ensure that the unruly passenger never reaches London. A door at the front of the plane, the one usually reserved for catering, began to hiss and slide open. Instead of ground crew, three figures in tactical gear stepped inside, their faces completely obscured by dark visors. They weren't carrying standard airline equipment. In their hands, they held illegal weapons, long and matte black, fitted with suppressors. The cabin erupted into screams. I stepped forward, shielding the woman in 1A, but one of the figures raised their weapon, aiming it not at me, but at the cockpit door. "Step aside, Mr. Thorne," the leader said, his voice metallic through the mask. "We need to clear the flight deck, and then we're going to have a very long, very painful conversation about what you found in those containers." He clicked the safety off. The sound was deafening in the pressurized cabin. I realized then that my status, my money, and my influence meant absolutely nothing here. I had triggered a silent alarm that had brought a death squad to my doorstep. As they moved toward the cockpit, the floor beneath us suddenly shuddered. The plane lurched, and for a split second, the engines roared to life. Not with the steady hum of a flight, but with the violent, irregular sputtering of a machine being pushed past its breaking point. We weren't staying on the ground anymore. The plane began to taxi, fast, toward the edge of the dark, unlit runway. I looked at the tactical team, then at the cockpit door, and finally at the emergency lever near the exit. I realized the only way out was to crash this party before we took off. But as I lunged for the leader, the cabin pressure suddenly dropped, and the masks began to fill with a faint, swirling mist. The hissing of the oxygen lines was the last thing I heard before the world tilted into a nauseating blur. The mist pouring from the ceiling wasn't air. It was a heavy chemical sedative designed to neutralize an entire cabin in seconds. I tried to hold my breath, forcing my muscles to tense, but the lethargy was instantaneous. It felt as if lead were being poured into my veins. As I collapsed against the bulkhead, my vision tunneled. The last thing I saw was the leader of the tactical unit stepping over my prone form, his boots heavy and rhythmic, moving toward the cockpit with the cold precision of a predator. I don't know how long I was out. It could have been minutes, it could have been hours. When I finally dragged myself back to consciousness, the silence was absolute. No engine hum, no cabin chatter, just the faint rhythmic dripping of water somewhere in the distance. My wrists were zip-tied behind my back, and the plastic was biting deep into my skin. I shifted, my head throbbing with a dull, persistent ache, and realized I was no longer in the cabin. I was lying on cold concrete, the air smelling of wet earth and industrial oil. As my eyes adjusted to the dim amber glow of a single hanging bulb, the realization hit me. I was in an underground hangar, somewhere deep in a subterranean complex. "Awake, are we?" The voice belonged to the leader of the tactical team. He was standing in the shadows, his helmet off, revealing a face that was hauntingly unremarkable. The kind of face you'd pass in a boardroom and forget a second later. He was holding my phone, turning it over in his hands as if it were a curious artifact. "You have a very sophisticated encryption on your personal cloud, Marcus," he said, stepping into the light. "It took us longer than we'd like to bypass the final layer. But here we are. You were looking for the source of the missing inventory. You thought it was just a local organized scheme. You had no idea you were peering into the ledger of a global infrastructure. You're not going to get away with this," I croaked, my throat raw. "This isn't a shadow operation. This is an international airline. You have passengers on that plane. You have families, children." "Had," he interrupted, his tone chillingly casual. "The plane has been scrubbed. The manifest is being altered as we speak. By tomorrow morning, Flight 492 will be recorded as a lost connection, a victim of a tragic, mysterious mid-air failure over the Atlantic. No debris, no survivors. And you, Marcus, you are the scapegoat, the unruly passenger who caused the disturbance, leading to a tragic accident. It's almost poetic." He tossed my phone onto the floor near my head. The screen was cracked, but it was still glowing. A message had been pushed to the lock screen. "Warrant issued. Charges of attempting to sabotage civil aviation and carrying illegal weapons." "They're pinning it on me?" I gasped, the sheer audacity of the move taking my breath away. "You were the one shouting about overriding the cockpit," he said with a thin, cruel smile. "You were the one threatening the crew. The internal security logs have already been scrubbed to reflect a version of events where you were the aggressor, the radical, the one who tried to seize control. The authorities are already on their way to investigate the wreckage, and they'll find your fingerprints on the override console. You've been served a heavy accusation, Marcus. an accusation by a state-level department for high-stakes crimes. You aren't a CEO anymore. You're a fugitive. My heart hammered against my ribs. They hadn't just kidnapped me, they had erased my identity and replaced it with the profile of a criminal. Why? I asked, desperation clawing at my throat. Why go to such lengths for a few missing crates of freight? He leaned down, his face inches from mine. The scent of stale tobacco and ozone clung to him. Because those crates weren't carrying commercial goods, Marcus. They were carrying the prototypes for the next generation of silent surveillance technology. The kind that makes the entire concept of privacy obsolete. Your company was just the delivery service. And you were the delivery driver who started looking under the hood. He stood up and pulled a small black device from his belt, a remote detonator. This hangar is rigged. When I leave, the charges go off. You'll be buried under 20 tons of concrete, and the official story will be that you went down with the plane. He turned to walk toward the heavy steel door at the end of the hangar. It's a shame. You were a good businessman. But in this world, if you don't play by the rules of the house burns you out. As the steel door began to grind open, a sudden, piercing alarm echoed through the complex. Not the sound of a bomb timer, but the sharp, rhythmic pulse of an internal security breach. The man froze, his hand hovering over the detonator. "What is that?" he hissed, looking toward the ceiling. A voice, calm and detached, echoed through the intercom. Not the distorted voice from the plane, but a familiar one. A voice I hadn't heard in years. "Drop the weapon, Agent Vance. The internal security audit you thought you were running has just been overridden by the central authority. You're not being audited for theft anymore. You're being detained for attempted liquidation of a high-value asset." The hangar doors were blown off their hinges in a spray of sparks and debris. Through the smoke, I saw silhouettes, not of my captors, but of a specialized strike force, moving with a speed that made the tactical team look like children. Vance spun around, his weapon raised, but before he could squeeze the trigger, a series of silenced rounds found their mark in his shoulder. He fell, the detonator skittering across the floor toward me. I lunged for it, my bound hands frantically searching for a sharp edge on the concrete, when the main lights of the hangar flooded to blinding white, and a woman in a dark, tailored coat walked into the center of the room, looking down at me with an expression of cold, professional interest. "Mr. Thorne," she said, pulling a file from her coat, "I'm with the Internal Security Review Board. We've been waiting for you to trigger this response for a very long time. But we have a problem. The people you are fighting, they aren't just a rogue group. They're a department of the government itself. And by saving you, I've just declared war on the people who signed my paycheck." The woman standing over me didn't wait for an answer. She signaled to her team, and in seconds, the zip ties binding my wrists were sliced away by a serrated blade. As the circulation returned to my hands, a painful, tingling rush, I struggled to my feet, my legs wobbling from the lingering effects of the sedative. "Who are you?" I demanded, rubbing my wrists. "You say you're internal security, but you just took down a black ops unit that claimed to be sanctioned by the highest levels of the state. If you aren't part of the scheme, why was I kept in the dark?" The woman, who identified herself only as Agent Sterling, didn't look at me. She was focused on downloading the data from the server rack in the corner of the hangar. "We needed a catalyst, Marcus. The organized network you were tracking, the one that had infiltrated the docks and, clearly, the airline, was too deeply embedded. We couldn't strike without proof that would hold up in an international tribunal. We needed them to get desperate. We needed them to act out in a way that made them visible. You provided that." "I provided that?" My voice rose, the anger finally burning through the fog of the drugs. "I was on that flight for a business meeting, not to be a pawn in your counterintelligence game. You let them drug those passengers. You let them threaten to dispose of an entire plane load of people. You call yourself security, but you're just as bad as they are." Sterling turned, her expression unyielding. "In a war of attrition, collateral damage is a variable we calculate, not a moral failing we indulge in. You are alive. The passengers were recovered by our medical team before the hangar was secured. The plane was landed at a remote airfield under our control. Everyone is safe." "Safe?" I spat the word back at her. "They've marked me as a fugitive. They've broadcast a nationwide notification that I'm responsible for a terror-adjacent crime. My assets are frozen, my reputation is in the shredder, and I'm legally dead. How exactly am I safe?" She pulled a tablet from her coat and swiped the screen. A headline from a major news outlet appeared. "Thorne Aviation CEO under investigation for illegal weapons transport." International manhunt underway. You aren't a fugitive, Marcus. You're a ghost, she said coldly. We've scrubbed your digital footprint from the public records. To the world, you were never on that plane. To the law enforcement agencies currently hunting for you, you're just a name on a file that will soon be erased from their servers. But there's a catch. There's always a catch, I muttered, pacing the concrete. The people you were fighting, the ones who called themselves an interested party, they have a contingency. They knew we were monitoring them. That's why they moved so fast to frame you. They don't just want you gone, they want your infrastructure. If you stop fighting now, they will move on your company by dawn. They'll seize your warehouses, they'll liquidate your assets, and they'll use your supply chain to move their illicit cargo under the cover of your own brand. I looked at her, searching for a trace of honesty in her eyes. I had built Thorn Aviation from a single-engine cargo plane in a garage into an empire. It wasn't just my livelihood, it was my legacy. What do you want from me? I asked. We need you to go back, she said. Not to the office. We need you to go to the heart of the network. We found the primary node on their server, the destination for those prototypes. It's a private maritime terminal in the middle of the Pacific, disguised as an automated, crewless facility. If you can physically access the terminal, you can upload the code I have here. It will wipe the network, neutralize the encryption, and force them to shut down. But you'll have to go through the security systems of a base that has been hardened against a military invasion. You want me to commit a break-in? An actual crime? I asked, laughing dryly. The irony is not lost on me. It's not a crime if the goal is the dismantling of a criminal enterprise, she replied. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small metallic card, a key card with no markings. This will grant you one-time access to the primary server room. You have 6 hours before the facility resets its protocols. If you don't succeed, you'll be trapped inside when the system initiates its own destruction. And this time, there will be no rescue. I took the card. It was ice cold. And what happens when I'm done? Do I just walk away? If you survive, you'll get your life back, she said, though there was a flicker of doubt in her tone that she couldn't quite mask. Or we'll make sure you disappear permanently so they can't come after you. She walked toward the exit, her team following her in perfect synchronized silence. Before she disappeared into the darkness of the night, she paused and looked back. One more thing, Marcus. We tracked the source of the order to put you on that flight. It didn't come from the rogue agents. It came from your own boardroom. Someone in your own company tipped them off the moment you started asking questions about the shipping manifests. I felt the blood drain from my face. My chief operating officer, my right-hand man for a decade, was he the one who had sold me out? Before you head to the terminal, Sterling said, her voice dropping to a whisper, you might want to check the encrypted channel on your phone one last time. Your COO just sent a message to the people who are trying to kill you. He's closing the deal on the sale of your company. I pulled the cracked phone from my pocket. There on the screen was a single, terrifying notification from my own private secure server. Assets, transfer, authorized. Welcome to the new regime. I tapped the screen and my heart stopped. The transfer wasn't just for the company. The COO had authorized the transfer of my personal bank accounts, my property deeds, and even my medical identity. I was being stripped of my existence in real time. I looked up at the door, but Sterling was gone. The only sound left in the hangar was the ticking of a clock and the heavy, metallic clatter of the hangar doors being locked from the outside. I was alone, and I had exactly 5 minutes to get out before the structure and my life vanished into history. The concrete walls began to groan, a deep, tectonic shudder that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. The facility wasn't just being locked, it was being purged. As the high-pressure gas lines hissed and the fire suppression system began to pump a lethal, freezing aerosol into the room, I didn't think about the injustice of it all. I thought about the files. My COO, the man who had shared every triumph and trial for 10 years, had signed my death warrant for a seat at their table. I didn't run for the door. I ran for the auxiliary terminal Sterling had pointed out earlier. My fingers, still trembling from the residual sedative, flew across the interface. I wasn't just trying to survive. I was planting a trap. If you want the Empire, I whispered to the empty room, then you'll take every lie, every criminal shadow, and every piece of evidence I've spent months untangling. I bypassed the security protocols using the keycard Sterling had left behind. With a final desperate keystroke, I initiated the Thorn protocol. a hidden failsafe I had built into the company's architecture 3 years ago for this exact scenario. It didn't just wipe the network, it pushed the internal audit logs, the illicit shipping manifests, and the records of the interested parties directly to every major financial regulator, investigative news desk, and international law enforcement agency simultaneously. The screens in the hangar flickered to life, showing the data packets being routed globally. Access denied turned to upload complete. I didn't wait for the confirmation. I dove for the emergency maintenance chute, a narrow, vertical shaft leading to the drainage tunnels beneath the facility. As I hit the cold water of the storm drain, a massive explosion rippled through the hangar above, a wall of heat chasing me into the darkness of the subterranean labyrinth. 3 hours later, I crawled out into a salt marsh near the coastline, my clothes shredded and my lungs burning. I looked like a vagrant, but for the first time in days, I felt the sharp, clean air of the Pacific. I checked my phone. The battery was at 2%. The news feeds were lit up like a Christmas tree. Thorne Aviation Board in turmoil. CEO Marcus Thorne releases damning evidence of corporate collusion. Federal authorities raid corporate headquarters. COO arrested during attempted flight. Maritime terminal dismantled. The true scale of the organized scheme exposed. I sat in the sand, watching the sunrise paint the horizon. I had lost the company. I had lost my fortune. I had lost the illusion of a world governed by order. But as I watched the headlines shift from my disappearance to my whistleblowing, I realized that I hadn't lost my agency. I had taken it back. A week later, the legal storm had settled. The COO, cornered by the evidence I dumped into the public domain, had cut a deal to testify against the very people who had tried to recruit him. Sterling and her internal security board had been vindicated. The rogue faction within the government was being dismantled, and I was, for the first time in years, completely, blissfully off the grid. I was sitting in a small cafe in a coastal town thousands of miles from New York when a woman in a dark coat sat down at my table. She didn't look like an agent today. She looked like someone who had finally slept for the first time in months. "You did a hell of a job, Marcus," Sterling said, placing a manila envelope on the table. "The fallout is still hitting the fan. Every major network is tearing itself apart, trying to distance themselves from the scheme. The people who wanted you dead are now busy fighting each other to stay out of a cell for the next few decades." "And the company?" I asked, sipping my coffee. "It's being reorganized under federal oversight. It's not yours anymore, but the corruption has been cut out. It's clean." She pushed the envelope toward me. "These are new documents, a new identity, a clean start. You saved a lot of lives, Marcus, more than you know." I looked at the envelope, then at the horizon. I didn't need to be the CEO of a global empire to understand my worth. I had been tested by a system that demanded I bow, and I had chosen to burn the structure to the ground instead. "Keep the identity," I said, sliding the envelope back to her. "I'm not interested in hiding. I'm going to start something new, something small, something that belongs only to me." She smiled, a genuine, tired smile. "I figured you'd say that." I stood up, left a tip on the table, and walked out into the bright morning light. I wasn't the man who had boarded that plane in New York. I was someone who had walked through the fire and come out on the other side, stripped of everything that didn't matter, and ready to build something that could never be taken away again. The passengers on that plane had no idea how close they came to the edge, but they would go home to their families, and I would go home to a life that was finally, truly, my own. The game was over, and for the first time, I was the one who had written the ending.